Well, we have just discussed the ecology-based model in human ecology, and also the actor-based model in human ecology approach. Now, what we have just discussed in the first part of how ecology should be given importance, unlike the pioneer or traditionalists who were engaging in trying to understand the relationship between ecology and human society, they tries to understand by trying to inject the sort of cultural adaptation to human environment, but rather Roy Rappaport to some extent has bring a new avatar in terms of trying to understand the ecology and human society. Rather than explicitly giving importance to the cultural adaptation to environment, he tries to engage in looking at how ecology and the human society rather has interrelate, or the kind of relationship which human society has shared with the ecosystem. Now, in that, it tries to establish the way human tries to make sense of the environment by engaging in certain kinds of rituals and ceremonies. And these rituals and ceremonies, to some extent, might appears to be something which is maladaptive, but rather if you look at the manifest function, or rather looking at the emic perspective, it tends to serve a purpose for the Sembaga community, which he strongly or provocatively discussed in his work Pigs for the Ancestors. Now, in that book, in that work which Rappaport has looked at, the slaughter of pigs is not to be seen in terms of the numbers of animals which are killed at one go or at a time, but rather it has to be seen as the kind of needs or necessity which that particular social rituals demands for. Because as we had discussed, pigs are normally slaughtered when people really come back quite exhausted, or they really need some kind of nutrition for consumption. Therefore, at that point of time when people really need that kind of supply of nutrition, a number of pigs are being slaughtered and it is being treated. Now, similarly, if we try to posit that example in the context of the actor-based model in human ecology, it is also to do with how an individual success or status in the society is also being defined by the kind of or the number of pigs an individual rear. Because the more number of pig one has possessed or one has belonged, then or owned rather, it tends to sort of gives a lot of value or status where an individual occupies in the social structure. Now, therefore, in human ecology, it is also important to identify where an individual tries to situate oneself in trying to make sense of one's positions in relationship with the ecosystem. Now, there can be different processes in terms of trying to make sense of how an individual takes certain decisions in the interest to their environment is perhaps a valuable approach for understanding how change occurs in social systems, also in response to the environmental perturbations. Now, to some extent, this actor based model approach is also useful in order to understand how traditional farmers accept or reject certain kind of agriculture innovations. Now, if we look further by the study which is made by Michael Morkman way back in 1968, he cited an example of how an individual tries to explain, or those peasant rice farmers in northern Thailand tends to explain the kind of adaptations which they have undergoes over a period of certain times. Now, usually the kind of evolution which takes place in agriculture in terms of technology is, the finer the technology is, people tends to engage in using certain kind of heavy machines like tractors. Now, for instance, what Michael tends to find out from his study is, in northern Thailand there are a lot of farmers who adopted to these tractors under certain kind of certain specific environments, while others still continues to use the traditional modes of plowing, for instance by using this water buffalo under other circumstances. Now, in this you can actually see how an actor or the individual tends to reorient or tries to make sense of the changing circumstances of the environment by exploiting or adapting to exploiting certain kinds of technology by adapting to certain environmental circumstances. Now, it is also interesting to see certain kinds of societies where they tends to come up with different modes of behavior in terms of relying on certain nearby technology in order to adapt or to overcome certain kinds of obstacles in their environment circumstances, which I will of course try to explain in the upcoming lectures in a further more detailed of certain case studies which are being conducted. Now, similar to what Michael has explained, these kind of practices in terms of how the farmers in a way are receptive to changes and also still continues with the kind of traditional modes of farming has to some extent tends to show that how an individual evolve oneself in terms of the changing environment circumstances. He also further tends to show that there is an urging willingness from the farmers in the country of Thailand. They tends to engage in improving rice plantations by adapting to varieties of food crops, like for instance the rational consideration of environmental forces, which in a sense affect the crop yields, which means in order to have much more bigger output, the farmers tends to engage in trying to use different kinds of food grains altogether, which in a sense in the long run enhances to their productivity. Now, by saying so, there has been a sort of a presumption that most of the farmers from the Asian countries tends to be seen as which are not complying or sort of resisting this modern technology. But then from this particular case study which is being carried out by Michael, in the context of Thai farmers, it is evident that the peasants tends to posit that they are highly receptive to change, if not they are rational decision makers who tends to carefully observe and assess the kind of agriculture innovations in terms of the potential benefits and cost. Now, usually traditional farmers are not really attuned to measuring these benefits and cost, because for instance many of the case studies, if you look at in terms of the slash and burn agriculture or Sweden agriculture or shifting agriculture, in this type of farming, if you actually see from an economic perspective, the amount of labor or investment which is being done in terms of the cultivations, and if you tends to measure with output, there's this sort of like an imbalances, because usually the output is low in compare with the kind of investment which is or labor which is being invested in that parts of farming. But in the context of the Thai farmers, it is interesting to see the kind of how they are willing to evolve themselves and to bring out certain kind of innovations in the context of this agriculture. Now, because they have been following these modes of trying to see the potential benefits and of course the cost. Now, in this very context, despite the promise of higher yields, modern cropping methods are often rejected simply because such innovations may require high inputs of fertilizers, pesticides and water, and these are something which of course is being witnessed across the globe. Now, for instance, when we talk about green revolution, no doubt the benefits and the kind of output, the productivity is enormous, but they can't do away without relying on this kind of using fertilizers, pesticides and of course different kinds of technology. And having known all this, to some extent many of the farmers are not receptive to such kind of innovations because owing to their poor economic backgrounds, and therefore these modern cropping methods are also much more in a way harmful or vulnerable to the environmental hazards such as floods, droughts and insects and disease outbreaks. Now, these are some of the the possible negative outcome if one engages in using the modern cropping methods. And apart from this, it is also evident that once a different kinds of variety of seeds or crops is being grown or introduced in a new area or geographical space, there are chances of altering the kind of soil nutrients, and also at the same time there is an excessive weights which come along with this kind of food crops. So these are some of the sort of apprehensions which are usually being encountered when a farmer tends to introduce some kind of newer things which were normally not usually practiced in that particular area. Now, going back to the examples of what we have seen from the Sambega community in New Guinea, an individual in the Sambega community in a way tries to raise the largest possible extent of pigs, not because that is the optimum strategy for adapting to the kind of environment which these people have lived on, but rather because that is perhaps the way in which he can as I said, enhances in terms of improving one's status in the social structure of that particular society, that is the Sambhaga society. Now, citing that parallel examples, if we see in the context of the Thai farmers again, they choose to grow a variety of rices, for instance the variety A instead of the rice variety B, because the farmer believes that it will give him a higher output from his agricultural land, and also a higher yield will allow him to give him a much more standard of living, which in a way is considered to be good in terms of the Thai cultures. Now, when we talk about culture, it is also about the social acceptability, or the kind of values which not just the individual but other members of the society also give equal meaning and values to that particular practices. Now, when Thai farmers in a way engage in this kind of agriculture innovations, or in trying to practice different forms of cropping system or farming rather, it is considered to be good in terms in relationship with the Thai society. Now, therefore, these kinds of decisions may or may not be justified or correct ones within the context of their cultural values, but they as an individual did not create these values. Then who creates this value? Instead, the values are pre-existing aspect of the social system into which these individuals were born. Now, sometimes the kind of decisions which an individual tends to engage upon may not be conform or may be accepted from that particular cultural values, but instead these values are seen to be which is more of a pre-existing aspect of the social system into which an individuals are socialized and born. Now, as a children, as human being tends to grow up, they were socialized to accept these values as something which is seen to be correct and which needs to be conformed by the other individual members. And as adults, they tend to grow up, and then when they become adults, they make their choice about their interactions with the environment in terms of those values. Now, those values are not something which is embedded within the culture, but it is being a learning process, an ongoing process, the way in which individuals as they becomes an adult interact with the environment, and so is the kind of value which is being shown upon the environment. So, people tends to in a way evolve themselves in sort of socializing, at the same time interacting with their environments in terms of the kind of values it is being attached. Now, the farmers maybe 50 years back might associate themselves to their environment not necessarily in terms of the amount of the crops which is going to be yield or the output which is going to come. Rather, it is more of a regular practices because those days they were being guided by the idea of sort of subsistence. But as time changes, and then so as an individual evolve, the kind of environment they tend to perceive about also changes, because they tend to see agricultural land as something which is not just giving them a subsistence adequate for their means of livelihood. Rather, they tends to measure in terms of the kind of surplus value which also will give them from that particular agricultural land. Now, in a way, people are no longer being guided by that subsistence modes of ideas, but rather in terms of the market oriented or the modern market system is how an individual's ideas or modes of behaviors are being influenced. Therefore, under this, in this very context, it is important to see or locate the actor-based model of human ecology, and this perhaps can be seen as one of the limited applications of this particular model. And also it can reveal a great deal about why individual within a particular social system make such kind of particular choices about their interactions with the environment that they do, is because one cannot really explain why their social system present them with the particular choices it does. Now, this is perhaps one thing which cannot be really explained by this actor-based model of human ecology, and that perhaps is the kind of limitations of that particular model. Now, after discussing the ecology-based models of human ecology and actor-based model of human ecology, we will try to see the third one, that is the system model, which is much more of a generalized or general system theory, which in a sense is concerned with the general properties of the structures and functions of systems. Remember, the structures and functions of system as such, rather than within their specific contents. Rather than giving a specific explanations of maybe the latent functions or manifest functions, in this particular system model, it tends to look at both the structures and functions of systems in a much more generalized structure. Now, according to this particular theoretical approach, for example, say atoms, cells, organism, ecosystem, societies, and even the universe as a whole together share the common properties of being self-organizing systems, and can therefore be studied in terms of a common theoretical perspective. That is, by using a particular single theoretical perspective, we can study all these in a much more holistic or as a whole, because they are sort of a properties which is self-organizing systems. Now, let's begin with trying to see from a French sociologist, Emile Durkheim, wherein he was sort of the pioneers in terms of looking at this functionalist perspective or structural functionalism. Now, Durkheim, way back in 1915, come up with his work called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. That is, how primitive societies engage upon bringing out certain kinds of their religious belief, or what perhaps can be the basic rudimentary forms of religion. What are the kind of functions it tends to, religion has played in the context of societies, even in the most simple form of society. Now, these particular works perhaps provide one of the basis for the development of the structural functional social system models. Now, Durkheim tends to see how peoples engage in looking at the kind of belief system they have. For instance, the Totemism. Now, what is totemism? Totemism is a religious belief that you tends to sort of give sort of respect, or a belief that some certain kinds of supernatural forces or spirits dwell in certain kinds of, say, plants, animals, or any kind of certain objects, and then you give certain kind of reverence to this, and this perhaps in a sense guide that particular individual, if not the society. Now, in these elementary forms of religious life, Durkheim tries to see that, explain how a religion is pretty much to be seen from the kind of functions it serves to the society as a whole. Now, the second form of approach, so to say, the structural functionalism, were also firstly articulated by some of the pioneer anthropologists like Radcliffe-Brown, Malinowski, and also being empirically studied by Evans-Pritchard and also by Raymond Furt. So, all these diverse institutions of society as seem to be organized into an integrated system, where its institutions fits harmoniously with every other one, and where change in any single institution would sort of ramify into a complementary change in all the other institutions with which it was functionally connected. Now, what Durkheim actually posits was, he tends to see society as the first form of organization where how religion in a sense is being created. Now, for Durkheim, society perhaps is the society itself in a way is a religion, and it is through this religious belief the members of the society are being integrated, and certain kinds of sort of solidarity is being manifested in the context of what Durkheim tries to look at. Now, let us try to explain further what structural functionalism models tries to actually talks about. It tends to looked at societies as a system which proved to be of great value, not just operationally, but also by producing many new insights into the ways in which societies were perhaps being organized. Now, for instance, certain kind of practices which were prevalent in the traditional society can be given here as an example. Now, one of the like simple, so to say, or maybe outmoded in the modern parlance, for instance, the payment of bride price, if you look at in many of the tribal societies, which in essence can be antithetical to the dowry system which is practiced in the caste Hindu society. Now, this kind of bride price, which was pretty much prevalent in tribal societies, in essence became comprehensible when it was perceived that it in essence sort of served to strengthen the kind of matrimonial bonds which exist in terms of, for instance, the making divorce more difficult, and that such strengthening was important, since marriage served politically to unite otherwise autonomous clans. Now, I am sure you must have come across certain terms such as matrimonial alliances, where in olden time certain kings used to as a sort of a homage, if not an honor, tends to give away their daughters to certain neighboring kings in order to have a sort of accorded relations politically. Now, not adequate to that, but in a way you can give an examples of that. Now, similarly, there are different warring communities, and they tends to exchange their daughters, so that it also ensures some kind of a peaceful environments, because they tends to share some kind of kinship relations as a practice of this. Now, as a result of this, it serves some kind of a functional perspective or a functional purposes. Now, these sort of practices, which was predominant in earlier societies, were perhaps perceived to be seen as a quaint or something which is a savage custom. But if you look at of those practices now, those were now recognized as serving a very important function in the maintenance of a tribal social solidarity. Now, those kind of practices, if you looked at the kind of latent functions it serves, that is the ethic, can to some extent be seen as sort of the backbone of how social solidarity is being established between different clan groups in the same maybe tribe, or maybe across different tribes. Now, those kind of practices, if you see from a structural functional model, it does serve a purpose, and it has to be seen from that particular context. Now, going further, Durkheim come up with a terminology called social facts. Now, what does social facts means? Social facts to Durkheim has to be sort of explained only in terms of other social facts. That is, how things has to be seen in relation to others. That is, one could not seek or explain the causes of social change outside the boundaries of the social system itself. It has to be explained and seen in the context of that particular social system. Now, therefore, it is important to interpret or make sense of an explanation from that particular context of that society. Now, similarly, the development of human ecology also has to be located or seen in a way as an attempt to escape this particular theoretical impasse by treating social system as open rather than closed system. Now, it has to be seen in a much more vibrant, and how it has the social system is also being influenced by the existing ecosystem. Now, similarly, therefore, the works of Julian Stewart, which we perhaps have discussed in the context of this how cultural ecology has emerges. Now, what Julian Stewart has tries to explain or rather propound is, it tends to recognize the social facts, and these social facts must be explained not only in terms of other social facts, but also in terms of ecological facts. Now what then is ecological facts? Now, ecological facts also has to be premised in that particular ecosystem, as what Durkheim has used in social facts, that is to be seen within that social system. Now, as we had given an example of that bride price. The bride price has to be explained in terms of the applicability within that context, how it tends to sort of cater to the needs of in bringing the social solidarity of that particular society. And similarly, in cultural ecology, things has to be seen in terms of how the human society, their cultures are more or less related with their ecology, or how ecology is adapting or making sense or functional of that environment. Now, in this general system approach, it is to be seen as more of an alternative approach. The kind of the system model of this human ecology, in a sense, tends to sort of emphasize the social system as they interact with the ecological system. Now, for instance, usually we talk about what adaptation is assumed to occur, not to be seen as not just at the level of discrete cultural traits or social institutions, as in the model of cultural ecology, or maybe in terms of the specific human population, as in the ecosystem based model of human ecology. Rather, it has to be seen in totality, that is the total system as a system. One should not engage in trying to see breaking up with coming up with different espousing different kinds of models, but rather it has to be seen as a total social system. This is something which is being seen from the system models of human ecology. Now, going back to what Stewart in a sense explained, or trying to bring in these cultural traits in trying to make sense of the environment, cultural trait does not in a sense necessarily tries to function to ensure the welfare of either individuals or the local populations, but instead it primarily tends to serve to ensure the survival of the social system itself, which means it gives primary importance to the social systems rather than the individual or the local populations. Now, if one stands to see from this perspective, if we give we cite an example of the Sembaga community, where the ritually regulated warfare of the Sembaga is not to be seen as something which is directly benefiting either most of the individuals or the local population as a whole, right? Now, either the individuals nor the local population in essence benefit from this kind of engaging in warfare. Rather, in this system of this model of this human ecology, both the social system and the ecosystem with which it interacts, remember the interactions between the social system and the ecosystem, retain their integrity as a system, with it changing its structural configurations according to its internal dynamics. Now, when we talk about the structural configurations, we can see the amount or the numbers of pigs which are being slaughtered, and the internal dynamics is something which that slaughtering of the pigs serve the purpose for that particular community which they engage in that particular rituals. Now, the system model of human ecology, as we had discussed, further emphasizes 4 relational aspects. Now, the first one is the inputs from the ecosystem into the social system. These inputs, for example, are in the forms of flows of energy, maybe the food or maybe the petroleum, and also it has material aspects like protein construction, so on and so forth, or maybe an information like the sounds, the visual stimuli. So, all these things in a way is partly the kind of relational aspect which is being focuses in the system model of human ecology. Now, the second is the inputs from the social systems into the ecosystem. The first one is the ecosystem into the social system, and the second is the social system into the ecosystem. Again, these in a way can take the form of the flows of energy, materials, or information generated by human activities. Now, the third is change in the institutions making up of the social system in response to the ecosystem. That is how the institutions tends to see the social system in response to the ecosystem. Maybe and often are adaptive, that is they contribute to the continuing survival of the social system under the changed environmental conditions. In other words, this social system itself, rather than the people who are involved in it, that is the individuals, that is the unit of natural selections and adaptations. Now, the social system in essence is given much more importance here again. Now, the fourth types of these operational systems is the changes in the ecosystem in response to the inputs from the social systems. Now, just as human society changes in response to the environmental influences, so does the ecosystem change in response to human influences. So, there is this sort of a vice versa kind of a relationship. Remember, the environment also has changes because of the influences of human. The kind of activity, any amount of activity has certain kind of implications on the ecosystem, and such change in essence may be either primary or maybe the direct impact of a human activity on an ecosystem component, such as the killing of a particular species, maybe a bird, maybe uprooting maybe a small plant, or maybe animal species by overhunting, or a secondary alteration in other ecosystem components caused by anthropogenic primary change in one component. Now, therefore, we as an individual or as a human, the kind of activity which we normally engage upon minimally, to some extent has changes on the ecosystem. Now, the point of what we have discussed in this four emphasis within the system model approach is, the point of discussion is that the kind of relationship between the social system and the ecosystem is both complex and dynamic. Now, why is it complex and why is it dynamic? Because the virtue of the system of this model of human ecology is that it focuses attention on the processes of change and adaptation rather than emphasizing the static structural characteristic of the social and ecological system. It tries to see the process of change and adaptation rather than emphasizing on the static structural characteristic. Moreover, this system approach avoids any necessity for specification of a universal prime mover for change. Neither environmental nor social factors have any a priori primacy, because impulses for change may flow in either directions. It can be negative, it can be positive. So, the impulses for change can flow in any particular directions. Therefore, there is no inherent contradiction between the system modeled and the actor modeled of human ecology, because apparently it might sound that the actor based model based approach and the system model approach may contradict, because the latter approach is simply one among many that can be incorporated with the larger social system framework. Certainly, the kind of decision making which an individual participants, maybe in the context of the Thai farmers as we had discussed, affects both the character of the social system and its interactions with the ecosystem, but has already been discussed. All these decisions are being made within the context of this system, and within this, perhaps the greatest virtue of the system model of human ecology is that it tends to espouse, offer certain kind of specific guidelines for doing research on human interactions with the environment. It doesn't limit itself to a single specific model in terms of looking at the relationship between human and ecology. Rather, this system model approach in a way can usher in a different kinds of understanding for a further holistic understanding of doing research in terms of the human interactions with the environment. Now, as we have discussed the different forms of models of human ecology and how or to what extent the different models are being followed in trying to make sense of human ecology, that is the society or the actor based model approach, or maybe society based model of human ecology. All these are to be seen in the context of how it tends to sort of to be located. Now, as we had seen in the 70s and the 80s, there is an emergence of certain kind of radical culture relativism, and in the 1990s again the ecological anthropologists rejected this extreme form of this cultural relativism, and accordingly tends to disagree with the modernist dichotomies, that is body and mind, action and thought, and nature and culture. This was argued by Milton in way back in 1977. Now, recently in the ecological anthropology, ecological studies, they tends to include the political ecology aspect as well, by uniting more traditional concerns for the environment, technology, social organization nexus. Remember these incorporations of new ideas, that is how technology is brought in trying to understand or the relations between environment and social organization, the nexus of these particular system, with the emphasis of this political economy on power and inequality seen historically, the evaluations and critique of how the third world development programs and the analysis of environmental degradation. Now, when we talk about political ecology or the political economy on power, it tends to see how maybe the kind of trade-off which actually happens in the context of environment and development discourse, and who actually benefit and then who actually is taking the decisions in terms of certain kinds of policies and programs which are being initiated by the policy makers. Now, these are partly something which are of a newer field where the ecological anthropology studies also tends to delve upon. Now, what does to what states or what kind of situations are we into, and then the journey so far. The anthropological knowledge has been advanced by ecological approaches. The applications of these biological ecology to cultural anthropology in a sense adds a new scientific perspective to the discipline, and also ecological anthropology contribute to the development of extended models of sustainability for humankind. Through research and study with indigenous peoples in an ecological framework, anthropologists engage upon learning more about the intimate interactions between humans and their environment. Now, perhaps as in the beginning lectures which I gave, I talked about why in this modern parlance, in the context of ecological crisis, why is it important to see or bring in the ecological anthropology disciplines in trying to make sense of how the indigenous peoples are to be located in the context of a particular ecological framework. And through this kind of continuous engagement, scholars are engaged upon learning more about the kind of sort of interrelationship or the interactions which is shared by the humans and their environment. And within this framework, one tends to posit equations of how sustainably they were able to use or manage their resources. Now, in this newer forms of understanding and development, in the 1990s, this field, that is the ecological anthropology, has enhanced a subjective understanding or perception of the consequences of development of the imagined. Now, today, usually, how do we perceive development, and then how do we try to locate development in the context of the indigenous people, and how is development to some extent benefiting or being a destruction to many of those indigenous society. Now, development is also highly debated, and mostly if we try to see from in the context of environment and development, the perception or the understanding of development in the context of the north, that is the developed countries, and the south, that is the third world countries, is also different. The kind of engagement which people tends to perceive about the natural resources is also different. Now, the management of natural resources in the north, that is mostly in the developed countries, is seen as something more of a romanticization, or if not a recreational framework, or is seen as more of enhancing their means of livelihood or well-being. But in the context of the south, that is in the third world countries, resources are seen as something which is pretty much embedded with their means of livelihood. Now, in this particular debate and discourses, one also needs to locate or understands the debate of this environment and development. Now, this presence of this perhaps talks about how in the Amazon or the Amazon forests are being depleted as a result of the kind of development projects which are being initiated. Now, this presence of ecology or an interdisciplinary understanding which are being initiated by the within the discipline of ecological anthropology adds sort of a new dimensions in terms of the theory and the methods which the research in this particular paradigm. So, one needs to look, or maybe this ecology and ecosystem and anthropology adds up a new dimensions into these approaches. Thus, ecological investigations in a sense bring sort of an additional hybrid vigor to the field of anthropology, and we'll try to look further into some of the works of the ecological anthropologists in particular, and the anthropologists in general, and also some of the works of the philosophers who works in the field of ecology and environment, and also some environmentalists who deeply engage upon in trying to make sense of the human environment interactions. Now, this would be covered up in the upcoming lectures, and I'll stop here.